Hi, I'm Yanjie. I will be presenting our work estimating GPU memory consumption of deep learning models. This is a joint work with Yu from Microsoft Research, Hongyu from Newcastle, and Zhengxian, Yonghao, Haoxiang, and Mao from Microsoft Research. According to a recent empirical study on 4,960 failed DR jobs in Microsoft, 8.8% of the job failures were caused by the out of GPU memory, which accounts for the largest category in all deep learning specific failures. In fact, the OOM problem is not specific to the DR jobs in Microsoft. Another empirical study on 2,760 Stack Overflow posts also listed OOM as one of the 6 major effects of deep learning bugs. Let us first look at the representative deep learning model, ResNet 50. This model is proposed to solve image classification problems. It has 50 layers. More complex versions, even hundreds of layers. There are complex building blocks, such as convolution, residue connection, and fully connected layers. However, since the GPU memory consumption by a DR model is often unknown to developer before the training or inference job starts running, an improper model configuration or hyperparameters can cause such a job to run out of the limited GPU memory and fail. For example, as shown in the figure, if a PyTorch ResNet 50 training job with a batch size of 256 is scheduled on the NVIDIA Tesla P40 GPU, it will execute normally and consume about 22 GB memory. When it is scheduled on the NVIDIA Tesla P100 GPU, it will trigger an OOM exception because the DR model requires 22 GB of GPU memory, while P100 has only 60 GB in total. So, understanding GPU memory consumption is important. We've summarized some the benefits of estimating GPU memory consumption of DR model. First, it can reduce out of GPU memory failures for DR jobs. It can save platform resources such as GPU, CPU, storage, and network. It helps developers choose an optimal model configuration. Benefit AutoML tools to improve search efficiency. Optimize DR job planning and scheduling. However, the memory estimation is a very challenging thing for the following reasons. The hybrid programming paradigm drawn by the DR frameworks has the internal execution. It loses tracking the precise GPU memory usage. It is hard to analyze the GPU memory usage of low-level framework operators, the NVIDIA cuDNN, cuBLAS, or CUDA API invocations, and the nested loops. There are many hidden factors within the framework runtime. The allocation policy, such as alignment, fragmentation, and reservation. The internal usage, such as CUDA context. Implementation choice, multiple convolution algorithms in cuDNN. We propose an analytic estimation approach based on the following observations. The execution of a DR model can be represented as forward and backward propagation on its computation graph. So calculate the memory required by operators. We also simulate the job execution via graph traversal. Also simulate the memory allocator. Then we get the accurate memory estimation results. The basic building block of the estimation is define analytic and framework independent memory cost functions for operators of TensorFlow, PyTorch, and MXNet. We also extract many runtime impact factors, such as alignment, fragmentation, pre-allocation, deallocation, reservation. So the CUDA context and CUDA workspace are also considered. Finally, we also consider target single device and data parallel training and model inference. To fully understand how GPU memory is used by a DR model, We firstly classify the allocated GPU memory into 4 dimensions and listed them in the table. The first one is the weight tensor. It contains 2 subcategories. The weight represents the learnable parameters of operators. The weight gradient represents gradients computed under backward propagation for updating weights. The second one is in-out tensor. It contains 4 subcategories. The first is the initial input. The second is operator input. The third is the forward output. It represents the output of an operator computed under forward propagation, and the output gradient. It represents the gradients under backward propagation for calculating weight gradients. The third one is the informal tensor. It contains 2 subcategories. The CUDN workspace represents the additional GPU memory used by the CUDN APIs. The second temporary tensor represents the temporary variables used in operator implementation. Finally, we also summarize a category called resident buffer. It contains 3 parts. The first is the CUDA context. The CUDA context represents the managing information to control and use GPU devices. And the second is the internal tensor fragmentation. And finally, we also summarize some allocator reservation. For example, release yet unclaimed tensors, pre-allocated memories, external tensor fragmentation, and the mysterious reservation, such as the fusion buffer used by Harwood. This figure shows the sample PyTorch training program, which set up a sequential model using framework built-in operators. From this lens, we'll construct a deep learning model, such as convolution 2D, pooling 2D, and the view and the fully connected layers. The view will reshape the previous tensor. Later, the code will train a deep learning model. The original code doesn't give enough clues on how the training is processed. There is also no memory allocation API call, which prevents us from directly analyzing the source code for memory consumption allocation. PyTorch constructs a computation graph in figure and applies iterative forward and backward propagation on it to learn the optimal ways. Such a graph is augmented with some system-crafted operators for backward propagation. Under the forward propagation, the left of the figure, input data x is fed through the neural network and manipulated by the above developer-specific operators. Produced output and input labels are then propagated backward to compute weight gradients. Finally, an optimizer is responsible for weight updates to minimize the loss. Initial input, weight gradient, input and output tensor, output gradient, informal. In the computation graph just now, we will first calculate the memory allocation of tensor in each operator through the cost function listed in this table. Let us use the motivating examples operator to illustrate how memory cost functions look like. First, we will summarize the convolution-related operators. It contains operator 2D in forward propagation and conv2D BP1 in backward propagation and conv2D BP2 in backward propagation. Second, we will have the average pooling operator. It contains average pool 2D in forward propagation and average pool 2D BP in backward propagation. Finally, it also contains the fully connected operator. It contains linear in forward propagation and linear BP1, linear BP2 in backward propagation. Let's select one tensor. For example, we will introduce how it can be estimated for the tensor size. The SF represents the precision format of data type, such as float 32. CI represents the input tensor channel. HF represents the filter height. WF represents the width of filter. CO represents the output tensor channel. WM represents the size of weight tensor in COM2D operator. Other operators related to tensor have the similar formulas for tensor size estimation. When we have the memory cost function of each operator, we can analyze the tensor liveness and traverse the computation graph, and then analyze the current model peak memory consumption. Let's see this example. With the execution of each operator, the framework will allocate memory for the tensor needed for the operator. So we highlight this COM2D. It will apply 3 tensors, and then it will release and catches tensors that will not be used in the future, such as when you execute average pool 2D, the E1 temporary tensor liveness analysis is dead and then release the dead tensor. So other operators will have the same allocation and deallocation policies. So we will execute linear, loose BP, linear BP, linear BP1, average pool 2D BP, COM2D BP1. Then you will see the OF1, OF2 is dead and then be released. COM2D BP2. Okay, as the whole process is iteration, so we will use one iteration, then we will get the peak memory. It can be reproduced. In order to accelerate the efficiency of memory allocation and deallocation, the framework builds a memory manager. While traversing the computation graph and tensor, the memory will simulate memory allocation and deallocation to obtain more accurate memory consumption. This figure illustrates how GPU memory is possibly consumed in training the above motivating DR model. The vertical axis represents the operator execution ordering, such that COM2D executes first, average pool 2D is the second, linear then follows. The horizontal axis shows the consumed GPU memory when a certain operator is executing. The green parts are the allocated memory for in-use tensors. Yellow parts are the internal tensor fragmentation if the original tensor sizes don't align to a power. The gray parts are the reserved memory by the framework allocator. For example, after a tensor is out of use, its memory block could be cached instead of returning to the GPU immediately. Since the CUDA context is allocated when DR frameworks initialize, we do not draw it on the figure. Initially, before the operator execution, the first line, GPU memory is applied for the 2 initial input tensors, data X and data Y. And the extra memory, the gray rectangle, is pre-allocated to make future allocation more efficient. When COM2D executes, the framework allocator will pass a little more GPU memory as internal tensor fragmentation to the ephemeral tensor E1, since its size is not aligned. After COM2D has finished, E1 reaches the end of its life and is then released. However, the corresponding memory block is cached and will be reallocated to later use. So first, I will introduce the experimental setup. We evaluate the memory under 3 popular DR frameworks, TensorFlow, PyTorch, MXNet and with specific framework version and CUDA and CUDN version. For each framework, we experiment 5 representative DR models: VGG16, ResNet 50, Inception V3, LSTM BERT based. We also designed matrices to evaluate the effectiveness of DN memory. We use relative error between the real and estimated GPU memory consumption. The error, the percent error is that the estimation result minus real result and is divided by the real result and times 100. The smaller errors indicate better estimation accuracy. This experiment evaluates the overall effectiveness of DN memory in estimating GPU memory consumption. This table lists the experimental results for VGG16, ResNet 50, Inception V3, and LSTM. The EST point is estimation result. SI is shape inference. BS 128 means batch size 128. The percent values denotes the relative errors. For TensorFlow, the average relative error is 5.9%. For PyTorch, the average relative error is 14.4%. For MXNet, the average relative error is 3.9%. We also compare DN memory with the shape inference, a static analysis technique to infer the tensor shapes of operator inputs, outputs, and weights. Currently, the 3 DR frameworks don't provide standalone shape inference tools. DN memory has already implemented our own using the framework APIs. On average, the relative errors of shape inference is about 43.0% for TensorFlow, 44.4% for PyTorch, and 39.4% for MXNet, which are much higher than those of DN memory. The reason is that DN memory considers hidden factors such as tensor allocation policy and CUDN workspace. An advantage of analytic approach is the interpretability that DN memory can present memory usage details, which will greatly help developers tune model configurations and framework runtime parameters. This table demonstrates how GPU memory is consumed by different categories of tensors and TensorFlow runtime when training the VG16 model. EST point is estimation. The percent values are relative errors. DN memory achieves low average errors of 5.88%, the total consumption. DN memory achieves low average errors of 5.88%, the total consumption. 17.33% level tensors, 42.42% allocation reservation, and 0.0% CUDA context. Because the internal fragmentation has a relatively small value, the estimation can cause a much higher average errors. It's about 80.04%. Nevertheless, it contributes only a very small portion of the total GPU memory consumption. As for execution time performance, the estimation time of DN memory ranges from 0.6 to 0.7 seconds for the above experiments. DN memory has an order of magnitude speed up compared with the real execution estimation. Next, I will summarize our work. This work is motivated by the many out-of-memory failures of DR job in Microsoft. DN memory adopts an analytic approach that systematically explores many memory consumption-related factors. Our extensive experiments show that DN memory can make satisfactory estimations of GPU memory consumption. Thank you very much.